What's going on, you bunch of heathens? Today we have a video from a channel that looks like it's somewhat like oversimplified, but not really. In the sense, and they're similar in the sense that they do animated history lessons. And this one literally randomly popped up on my homepage, and it looked interesting. The Pacific Empires, Japan versus the US, the path to Pearl Harbor. I know some of the lead up to Pearl Harbor, but I'm hoping this goes a bit more in depth on certain things. Or maybe I just learned stuff that I didn't know. But either way, should be interesting, so let's jump into it.
Pearl Harbor, October 1940. Admiral James Richardson
Should be
cables
cool.
the Chief of Naval Operations, demanding to know why the heck he's here. In April, the U.S. Pacific Fleet had left its home base in California to conduct exercises in the Pacific. Then 1 month in, he'd received orders to issue a press release stating that he was remaining at Pearl Harbor on naval business. He's furious.
The fuck is that
He
supposed
has
to
no
mean?
business here. And what he'd been told would be a 2-week stay has stretched to 6 months. Pearl Harbor is a
I can see
forward
why you
station.
would be pissed.
It doesn't have the facilities to properly house,
I would be pissed
supply,
about that.
or repair the fleet. Re-enlistments are down. Ammunition and fuel.
Wait, really? I thought Pearl Harbor actually had all this stuff for that. Huh. I actually thought it was like a properly outfitted base and all that. That's interesting to know.
Short, morale has collapsed. Why is his fleet being left to rot? Finally, he gets an answer. President Roosevelt wants the fleet in Pearl Harbor as a deterrent against Japanese attack in the Dutch East Indies and to give America leverage in diplomatic negotiations. The U.S. Pacific Fleet is now a pawn in a high-stakes game, one where Roosevelt
This doesn't
unknowingly
seem-
is running out of time.
Uh-oh.
Say, would you like to see the next
history.
episode of this series immediately after watching this one instead of waiting a full week? Well, now with the new Nebula.
Whoa. This is 2 years old, so I think I'm good.
Nebula first, you totally can. Learn how to get access to the Curiosity Stream Nebula bundle after the episode. Hey everyone,
Okay.
Quick note up top. This series will be drawing on 2 previous shows we've done about the history of Japan. Of course, you don't need to have watched them, but we're also not going to repeat some info on previous topics much. So, if you
okay.
want extra background or just to brush up, you can check out our completed series on the end of the samurai and Japanese militarism.
Oh, that'll be cool. I'll have to check those out. That sounds like it'd be a cool video. Because that's actually one thing I definitely don't know. I know vague stuff, very vague stuff, though, when it comes to, Western influence into the end of it. But that's it, really vague stuff. And maybe some stuff that, Stakui said. But that could be an interesting watch.
Links to those in the description, but now, on to the infamy. December 7th, 1941 is one of the most famous dates in world history.
Nah, that's crazy. That is a crazy infographic fucking little picture to put when it comes to Pearl Harbor. That's fucking crazy. That's fucking wild.
The day that the Empire of Japan attacked the U.S. naval station at Pearl Harbor, bringing an unaware America into World War II. That is, traditionally, how it's
You
told
poked the
in
bear.
textbooks and documentaries. But it's not the full story, or even
Nope,
in
it's
many
not.
ways, the
Actually,
real story
now that
of
I think
how
about
and
it,
why.
on one of my previous history reacts, I put in a little tidbit of it. I want to say it was it oversimplified, I think? Where it might have been the oversimplified video that I did, but I did a little extra tidbit into it because I actually did learn about a little bit of it. Weirdly enough, from what was the fucking movie I watched? It was a World War II movie that was more or less based off of them being stationed there. Was it Midway? It might have been Midway. I'm not positive though. But it was basically we kept fucking
Why
with their
these
trade
countries
because
came to
at the
blows.
time, from what I remember, it was because we kept messing with their trades that they kept trying to put through because they were super militarized at the time. So we were like, no, you can't be doing that kind of shit. And they did not like us trying to get involved because they kept trying to take over all their neighbors and shit. So that's what we ended up getting involved, stopping them, and eventually it came to a head in the form of Pearl Harbor, I believe.
Because mere weeks before the attack on Pearl Harbor, diplomats were still negotiating for peace, and even proposing that Roosevelt and Japanese Prime Minister Prince Konoye meet face to face. In fact, the road to December 7th was a crooked one, fraught with tense meetings, cultural misunderstandings, and dismissed warnings. A surprise attack that remained a surprise, even though the U.S. State Department had decrypted and was reading Japanese diplomatic cables about the operation. But to trace the roots of this conflict, we have to go back much further than 1940. We're heading back to the late 19th century, when both Japan and the United States emerged as Pacific empires. Both were late to Pacific colonialism. By the 1870s, Spanish colonies in the Philippines and the Marianas were already 3 centuries old, as were Dutch possessions in modern Indonesia. Heck, the British had been in Australia since the late 18th century, but the US and Japan, by contrast, had been constrained by internal factors, and only began to scramble for territory in the late 1800s. Japan, its centuries-long isolation ended by the expedition of American Admiral Perry, wanted to be counted among the great powers. And that meant
they would. Who wouldn't want to be?
Colonial empire. It started slowly at first, with the addition of islands, such as Okinawa, that it considered part of its historical borders. Then it moved on to Taiwan, Korea, and Sakhalin Island, spoils of the First Sino-Japanese War and Russo-Japanese War. The United States had a similar delay, since it had only become a Pacific power in the 1840s, when the Mexican-American War won it the Southwest and California, and a treaty with the UK ceded it the Oregon Country. Yet its first official forays into exerting power in its new Pacific domain, like Perry's expedition to Japan, were put on hold during the Civil War. But even then, U.S. expansionism continued, because U.S. interests in the Pacific were not initially territorial, but rather commercial and religious. Merchants trying to...
Yeah, that sounds about right, that we would rather fucking work towards cultural, I say cultural, but religious and actual money-wise. Economic, that's what I was going for. It doesn't surprise me that those were our first forays and not actual imperialism / militarism. I mean, we were pretty much at that time still a brand new country.
Strike it rich in the China trade established trading enclaves, and American whalers spread across the Pacific from the Arctic to the Antarctic. Plus, New England missionaries set down on nearly every island and port city from Honolulu to Yokohama. So, though not officially part of the U.S. government or its plans, this American presence forced the State Department to set up
it's not part of our plans, but we'll take
to serve these Americans abroad. Not to mention the purchase of Alaska in 1867.
Yep, Russian fuck up there. But, you know, I'd love to see them try to come take it.
Also increased American reach. But both the whaling industry and the China trade were dependent on reliable resupply stations, especially for the coal increasingly used to power ships. And since the best ports in the mid-Pacific, such as the Kingdom of Hawaii, imposed high taxes on refueling, the U.S. began looking for alternatives. It first claimed Midway Island, an uninhabited atoll that was part of the Hawaiian island chain in 1859, but the first efforts to dredge it into a useful harbor ended in disaster when the project failed and a naval vessel wrecked on return. So the U.S. Navy began looking for a more suitable location. After all, would it not be helpful to set up a naval station inside the Kingdom of Hawaii? In 1875, during the reign of King Kalakaua, the Hawaiian government signed a free trade agreement with the United States, deepening the already largely American.
And the natives of Hawaii have been ruining that day ever since. God knows we didn't exactly. I'm proud to be American, but we got some dark shit in our history, and we did kind of fuck over quite a lot of people.
presence in
But,
Hawaii.
should have
But
won.
upon the agreement's renewal in 1887, America insisted in negotiations that the U.S. Navy get exclusive rights to use an underdeveloped location as a coaling and repair station. The place, a pristine bay of several locks with lush oyster beds, would come to be called Pearl Harbor. Yet Pearl was inferior to the nearby commercial port of Honolulu Harbor, which could accept large, deep draft ships. By contrast, Pearl's entrance was shallow and mostly blocked by coral reef, with only a small entrance that had been cut by a native Hawaiian chief. And Congress didn't really want to shell out the money to develop it further. But then, in 1898, America's posture in the Pacific changed. In the wake of the Spanish-American War, a wave of empire-building politicians looked to the Pacific, no longer for commerce or conversion, but now territorial expansion. In 1893,
Yep, it was only a fucking matter of time before that happened. It was legit only a matter of fucking time. I mean, US, at that point, we've been looking to fucking expand for long enough to where, yeah, it would happen. It would happen. And, I mean, yeah, this is when it
a group of
did.
American businessmen and Hawaiian subjects of American descent staged a coup against the Hawaiian monarchy, with the goal of annexing the islands to the United States. However, when newly inaugurated President...
Wow. The first of many coups started by the US. And this would have worked, except, I'm assuming, whoever this is.
Grover Cleveland blocked annexation.
Except for Grover
the
Cleveland,
coup planners briefly
for whatever
formed
reason.
a republic to wait for the U.S. to elect an administration with a more expansionist mindset. And
Wow.
they got what they wanted in President William McKinley. See, when the United States took over Manila Bay in 1898 as part of the Spanish-American War, it was clear to the McKinley administration that the Philippines would not be liberated, but made a territory of the United States. And needing a way station to support America's Asian territory, McKinley gladly accepted the offer of Hawaiian annexation, as well as seizing the formerly Spanish Guam and claiming Wake Island. Within months, the U.S. had established a trans-Pacific empire with a reliable...
I did a reaction to it, but Fat Electrician actually did a video on... Where is it? Oh, come on.
Formerly Spanish Guam.
Was it? I want to say it was Guam. Hold up, let me check real quick. I could have sworn it was. I'm pretty sure it was Guam, unless it wasn't. How long ago was this? I got a bunch of fucking Fat Electrician videos because I love him and you guys seem to like him. Okay, I finally found the part of the video. Yes, it was Guam. Fat Electrician did a video on Guam on how we took it over, and I did a reaction to it. Yeah, it was fucking ridiculous how we seized it.
And claiming Wake Island. Within months, the U.S. had established a trans-Pacific empire with a reliable system of trade routes and way stations. Development work began at Pearl Harbor, with the Navy commencing dredging operations so it could finally accommodate large ships. And while the first dry dock collapsed in a 1913 engineering disaster, by 1919, Pearl Harbor finally became a functioning naval station. A functioning naval station that Japan looked on with unease. After all, they'd been thrust into this modern world by a visiting American fleet, and now they had the potential to have one at their doorstep. The combination of Pearl Harbor and the Philippines represented a new, potentially game-changing threat.
I can see why they'd get nervous. Like, I can really see that.
Allowing the U.S. to project naval power across the Pacific and into Asia. But despite a few diplomatic incidents, things remained largely cordial between the US and Japan. The two fought on the same side during World War I, with Japan further expanding its colonial possessions in the...
I actually don't really know much about what Japan was really doing during World War I. Like, I don't know really anything, if anything, about what they were doing during that time. Other than the basic, they fought with us and whatnot. Or they fought on our team, but the actual bits on whether or not, on what they did, I don't actually know. So that might be something I want to look into, because that'd be pretty cool.
The Pacific Islands, gaining a mandate over German colonies after the war. Yet that was where things started to sour. During the negotiations over the Treaty of Versailles, Japan led a push for a statement on racial equality in the treaty that the US knocked down. Similarly, the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, meant to limit the size of fleets to prevent another arms race and world war, constrained Japan to having only 3 capital ships for every 5 the US and Britain possessed, while the London Naval Conference of 1930 loosened this ratio.
Why were we trying to... Wait, what? Hold on, I was kind of trying to fix something on my end. What? Wait, what?
On racial equality in the treaty that the US knocked down. Similarly, the
Okay,
Washington
shitty
Naval
of
Treaty
us.
of 1922, meant to limit the size of fleets to prevent another arms race and world war, constrained Japan to having only 3 capital ships for every 5 the US and Britain possessed, while the London Naval Conference of 1930 loosened this ratio.
They were on our
heavy
team.
cruisers,
Why?
Making it 10-7. It was still rightly seen as an attempt to constrain Japanese naval power. It seriously
Yeah, it is. I don't
inflamed
understand
both
why we would.
international relations between the two
If they were,
countries,
especially
as
if they
well
were
as
on our
fueling
team.
hardline militarist parties in Japan. And in 1931, things shifted again. When
Yeah, I can see why the fuck that would piss them off. I mean, that makes no sense. I mean, we can play what ifs all the live long day on whether or not that would really fuck with anything if we didn't do that, but still, that's kind of weird,
Japanese
in my
officers
opinion.
staged the Mukden incident, using a false flag bomb attack on a rail line as a pretext to invade Chinese Manchuria. U.S. diplomats at the League of Nations attempted to stop the invasion by invoking a peace pact Japan and China had signed in 1928. Yeah, that had no effect. So, declaring that Japan's actions
Yeah, Japan at this point was like, nah, fuck that.
Secretary of State Henry Stimson announced that the U.S. would no longer be bound by the arms agreement. A new naval arms race in the Pacific had begun, and its conclusion ran a straight line to 1941, right to the U.S. Pacific Fleet languishing at Pearl Harbor, which we'll talk about next week. Yeah, about that. I hate calling myself out kind of live on the internet, but actually, narrator voice Matt, I was about to start watching Ep 2 of Path to Pearl Harbor right now over on Nebula. So, wait, what are you talking about, Ken?
Okay, so is this all a Nebula ad read? Okay, it is. It's one of those super long ones, like 2-minute long. Okay. This is really interesting. You know what? We'll do part 2 as well. We'll do part 2 as well. We'll hop in. Let's do this one as well.
Yangtze River, December 12th, 1937. The Japanese
Yangtze
dive bomber lets its payload go. The bomb smashing into the bow of U.S. Navy vessel USS Panay as sailors run to stations in disbelief. The U.S. and Japan are not at war. Part of the U.S. Navy's Asiatic Squadron, Panay is steaming away from the Chinese nationalist capital of Nanking, where it had evacuated civilians just before the city fell to the Japanese army. Now,
during the non-consensual blank of Nanking, or is this before that? And I think I do vaguely know of this. I think they weren't actually... I think they didn't know it was American, I think. I can't remember exactly.
Now, it's escorting 3 standard oil tankers away from the burning city, fleeing reports of mass murder. Sailors run to shelter.
Yeah, this is the non-consensual of Nanking.
Sprays machine gun fire at the fighters strafing the vessel. The captain is grievously wounded, and the vessel's second officer takes command, though moments later, shrapnel rips open his throat. He can't speak to issue orders, so he writes it on the bulkhead with his own blood. Abandoned ship.
Yo, fucking metal. That's fucking metal as fuck.
Thanks so much to World Anvil for helping us forge today's historical tale. It's December 18th, and in Tokyo, U.S.
fucking doing his own fucking whoosh sound effect. That's fucking funny.
Ambassador to Japan Joseph Grew is trying to prevent a war. Accords signed after the Boxer Rebellion had allowed U.S. Navy gunboats like the USS Panay to patrol Chinese rivers and protect American commerce. To attack one violated international law, and the details did not look good. Japanese planes had sunk the Panay, along with the 3 standard oil tanker ships, killing 3 Americans and wounding 48. They'd even machine gunned the lifeboats.
Oh,
this
shit.
Despite the fact that the Panay had radioed its position to Japanese forces.
Oh, no, so the Japanese did fucking know. Okay.
And marked itself with 3 large American flags. In the U.S., the public mood was one of indignation. While there was also anger at Japan for what was being called the non-consent Nanking, The public treated the attack on the Panay as an even worse affront, particularly because they saw it firsthand. Most of the evacuees from Nanking had been journalists, and one filmed the attack from the Panay's deck. Ambassador grew worried that if it escalates, this incident could lead to war. It felt like the USS Maine all over again, especially since Gru's boss, President Franklin Roosevelt, was far more willing than his predecessors to confront what he privately called the bandit nations of Germany, Japan, and Italy. In October, Roosevelt had even given a speech calling for a quarantine of aggressive nations, arguing that America should take an active hand in containing the epidemic of world lawlessness. But Roosevelt had suffered such an isolationist backlash against that speech that even he hoped to defuse the Panay situation as quickly as possible. So, Gru reached out to contacts in Japan's civilian government and business community, as well as retired Admiral Nomura, who was connected to foreign policy circles. But no one seemed to know why the Panay had been attacked. Some said it was a mistake,
so no one knows.
Others said it might be a plot by low-level Japanese officers to scare American forces out of China. American radio intercepts suggested it was intentional. But Gru also found Japanese leaders receptive to his demand for an apology. Both Japan's government and public were mortified over the incident, and within days, the American embassy in Tokyo was besieged by letters of apology from Japanese citizens, including school children, along with envelopes stuffed with yen for the victims. On December...
While super nice, and that's a super sweet story, that isn't what the US was looking for, though. Because unfortunately, you can have the US, you can have citizens try to be like, oh, we're so fucking sorry, we're fucking horrified by that. But unless the military actors in it, or just a big portion of the actual government, say sorry, it's not gonna. They aren't gonna appease us very well.
December 23rd, a Japanese delegation arrives at the U.S. Embassy to meet with Gru. They take full responsibility and designate a high-ranking naval officer to present a formal apology. In addition, they'll pay an indemnity of over $2 million to compensate the United States for the Panay and the 3 tankers. Yet they maintain that the attack was a case of misidentification. A pretty ludicrous position given the facts. But if it prevents a war, then it's a compromise Gru and Roosevelt are willing to make. The apology arrives in Washington on Christmas Day.
Not bad.
The fury over the attack diffused by the holiday season. In Tokyo, Japanese diplomats breathe a sigh of relief. For as much as Gru and Roosevelt want to avoid war, the Japanese government can't afford more complications in its Chinese quagmire. Despite early victories, it was becoming clear that in invading China, Japan had bitten off more than it could chew. The central government hadn't planned or even formally declared this war. It was capitulated into it by the actions of mid-level army officers, and there was no overall strategic plan or even an obvious goal. Instead, there were nebulous assertions about northern expansion and seizing resources, but the truth was, it was costing far more resources than it brought in, and the army's brazen massacres, like at Nanking, were wrecking Japanese diplomatic efforts, which was dangerous. Because the Chinese theater was a mess of international forces, none of which Japan could afford to antagonize. First, there were American and British river gunboats like Panay, literally sailing through the conflict. Then Germany was present too, despite being part of an anti-communist pact with Japan.
Yeah, but you also had, pretty sure at the same time, I mentioned this before, I'm not sure exactly when our support of them started coming through. It's somewhere in my old video, I'm not going to go searching for it, but we were, I think around this time, we were still sending weapons to help them, unless that didn't start happening. That might not have started happening until after the 1941.
It sold the Chinese nationalists equipment and provided military advisors. Meanwhile, the Soviet
Germany
Union,
was doing
wanting
that, so
to
we may
support
not have done that yet.
Had sent Soviet planes and pilots to shore up China's weak air forces and bomb Japanese bases, which was double scary since that risked Japan's greatest fear, war with the Soviet Union. And then there was the United States itself, which was playing both sides.
Yeah, we were. Okay, good. So we were.
Lay solidly with China, seeing it as a victim of Japanese aggression, and the U.S. government supported the nationalist cause with supplies routed through French Indochina. Yet, paradoxically, America also supplied Japan with the high-grade fuel oil Japanese ships and planes used to pound nationalist forces. Any one of these powers risked getting dragged into the conflict. And despite what some militarist fanatics insisted, Japan could not simultaneously fight both a Western power and China. A thing that only became more clear as 1938 and 1939 dragged on, and Japan and China cut negotiations. Now it seemed the only path Japan had for victory was to conquer China. Japanese forces kept advancing, but now it was clear that nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek was intentionally giving up territory, using the vastness of his country against them, so they had to commit more resources into holding it. And while the Japanese army was spread increasingly thin, they also had to deal with Maoist guerrillas, which sabotaged coal mines and other resources. Then in July 1939,
so you're just
the most terrifying thing.
Which means that they're just full on burning resources into this. Like they're burning resources that they just really do not fucking have. And what's even funny about it is the fact that they have to deal with what's supposed to be an ally in Germany helping their fucking whoever they're fucking fighting. Which is pretty fucking funny.
Thing of all occurred. A group of militarist officers posted near the border with Mongolia made a unsanctioned border incursion against the Soviets, hoping to trigger a conflict that would let Japan seize Siberia. Instead,
you fucking
the Soviets
dipshits
encircled and smashed the Japanese forces, making planners question
Not a big
whether
fucking
Japan
surprise.
could truly stand up to the full might of a Western power. Japanese diplomats, including Admiral Nomura, hastily concluded the conflict by recognizing the Soviet view of border claims. But it wasn't even a month before yet another diplomatic crisis gripped Tokyo, when Germany and the Soviet Union announced a non-aggression pact. Now, that was, as geopolitical scholars term it, a real dick move. The anti-communist treaty was supposed to align.
Oh yeah, because, anti-communist, but then we're going to make a pact with them. I also love it how this isn't Bad Mustache Man. It's just a standard German mustache man.
Japan and Germany against the Soviets. And now, without even telling Japan, Germany had concluded an agreement that gave the USSR peace on its western border, which meant that the Soviets could, theoretically, turn all their attention toward invading Manchuria.
Yep, and since they made this, despite their last one, I can also assume that Japan also is just like, well, what the fuck? Are y'all actually going to fucking honor our pact if Russia does attack us or what? So I can see how that would happen.
And Japan. Y'all, I'm starting to feel like this Hitler guy might be a little untrustworthy. Huh.
Maybe a little bit.
Meanwhile, shipments of American aircraft parts were suddenly drying up. It turned out that Roosevelt, while not making any public announcement, had privately requested American aircraft manufacturers to stop selling to Japan. Then, in July of 1939, Roosevelt escalated by canceling America's commercial treaty with Japan, effective January 1940. Not only would this be a commercial hit, but it removed the legal protections against the United States declaring an embargo. What would happen, Japanese officials began to ask, if he shut off our oil? Yet in that dark period, a window of opportunity opened. Germany invaded Poland in 1939, plunging Europe into war, and by June 1940, had swept across France and the Netherlands. So while Japan's northern expansion strategy, favored by the army, had clearly failed, because China was a quagmire and the Soviets too dangerous, the Imperial Japanese Navy's rival strategy of striking down into Southeast Asia to seize the rubber-producing regions of British Malaya and the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies was now suddenly possible. With the English, French, and Dutch busy fighting Germany, they wouldn't be reinforcing their positions halfway around the world. So for a brief time, the colonies of Asia appeared up for grabs. Japan could sweep in fast, just as Germany had overrun France. But that window might not be open for long. Heck, Germany itself might snap them up. The rallying cry, "Don't miss the bus!" echoed throughout the government, capturing the feeling of escalation and
This is actually pretty interesting. I knew quite a bit of this, but this is actually pretty fucking cool.
frantic activity. Japan's first step, it was decided, would be to move into French Indochina and cut the Western supply lines to nationalist China. And so as Nomura took a ship for Washington as his country's new ambassador, and Roosevelt mulled more.
Yeah, because, that one fucking thing of us, stopping our fucking embargo and shit. Yeah, let's keep poking them like, oh, hey. Overall, it's just a whole bunch of fucking people doing shit that they probably shouldn't have.
Preparing for its third undeclared war in 3 years. A war that would put it on a collision course with the United States. Oh man, Zoe, the lead up to Pearl Harbor is full of so many things to keep track of. I don't know how these world powers handled it before digital computers. Heck, I'm not sure how they handled it before World Anvil. As I'm sure you've realized by now, a bunch of us at
Okay, so we're going to call it here, and I'll do part 3 and part 4 at another time. Well, that was extra history. The path to Pearl Harbor. This is actually really cool fucking look into how we got to where we were in World War II with Pearl Harbor. So far, I've known quite a bit of this. There's some parts I didn't know about. I'm like with oversimplified. I'm sure they're skipping out on a bunch of stuff, but this is pretty cool so far. So make sure you check them out. Give them all the love that you can. Leave a like and subscribe if you want to keep seeing more of me and my shit. Yeah. Till next time, take care of yourselves.